Let's dive right into today's news. We've got a lot to unpack, from conflicts overseas to developments here in the U.S., and even some stories that will tug at your heartstrings.
It's a packed day, for sure. Let's start with some news out of Yemen. We're getting reports that recent U.S. airstrikes there have resulted in casualties.
Casualties, how many are we talking?
The Houthi-run health ministry, and remember, they control the northwest of the country, including the capital, Sana'a, they're claiming at least 15 dead and 9 injured.
And the Houthis are vowing to retaliate, right?
Exactly. They've made it very clear that they won't let this stand. They see these strikes as an attack, and they're promising a response. We're already seeing reports of explosions in Sana'a and Sada.
This is all tied to the conflict in Gaza, isn't it?
It is, unfortunately. The Houthis, while not the internationally recognized government of Yemen, are backed by Iran and consider Israel an enemy. They've been targeting shipping in the Red Sea as a way to put pressure on Israel in response to the war with Hamas.
And this targeting is having a serious impact on global shipping, right? The Red Sea is a crucial route for all sorts of goods.
Absolutely. It's a major artery for global trade. Think about it. 15% of all goods shipped by sea pass through the Red Sea. Now, with the threat from the Houthis, many big companies are choosing to go the long way around, diverting their ships around the southern tip of Africa.
That's going to add a lot of time and cost, isn't it?
Definitely. It's going to disrupt supply chains and drive up prices for consumers. It's a reminder of how interconnected our world is and how even conflicts that seem far away can impact us here at home. Former President Trump actually highlighted this issue recently, mentioning that it's been a long time since a U.S. flagship safely navigated the Suez Canal, over a year, and even longer for U.S. warships in that region. 4 months, to be exact.
So a lot of tension and uncertainty there. Meanwhile, over in Europe, we've got international leaders trying to find a way forward on Ukraine.
Yeah, big meeting happening right now with representatives from NATO, the European Union, you name it. Pretty much every major player except Russia is at the table. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, nearly 24 European nations all represented. The big focus is on pushing for a ceasefire.
What are the chances of that actually happening?
Well, that's the big question. It seems like there's some disagreement on how to actually get there. Sir Keir, for example, has been pretty critical of what he sees as the Kremlin dragging its feet, not living up to Putin's stated desire for peace.
So what's the plan then?
They've agreed that if Putin doesn't accept a ceasefire, and I mean immediate and unconditional, then the pressure on Russia needs to ramp up. They're talking about accelerating military support for Ukraine, tightening sanctions, and even exploring legal avenues to make Russia pay for the damages caused by the war.
But Putin hasn't exactly slammed the door shut on a ceasefire, right?
He hasn't, no. He's saying he supports the idea in principle.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
Of course. He's brought up what he calls nuances that need to be addressed, like potential rearmament by Ukraine and the logistics of how a ceasefire would be monitored and enforced. It's still very much up in the air.
So what's next in all of this?
Well, the military chiefs are set to meet soon to work out the practical details of what increased military support for Ukraine would actually look like.
Okay. Let's shift gears now and talk about something a little closer to home. There's been some controversy around former President Trump and his stance on Venezuelan immigrants.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about this. Trump recently declared that some of these immigrants, specifically those belonging to the Tren de Aragua gang, are engaging in what he calls irregular warfare against the U.S. He even issued an order to have them deported under the Alien Enemies Act.
Hold on. The Alien Enemies Act, isn't that a pretty old law?
It is. We're talking 1798. It was originally designed to deal with citizens of hostile nations during times of war. Using it in this context against immigrants is a pretty unusual move, and a lot of people are questioning its legality.
It sounds like those questions are already making their way through the courts.
They are. A U.S. District Judge, James Boasberg, has issued a 14-day halt on the deportations that would have happened under Trump's proclamation. Apparently, he even ordered planes that were already in the air with deportees to turn around.
Wow, he wasn't messing around.
Not at all. The ACLU and a bunch of other groups had already filed a lawsuit to block the proclamation before it was even issued. Judge Boasberg seems to have some serious concerns. He pointed out that the terms used in the act, things like invasion and predatory incursion, are more likely to be talking about actions by enemy nations, not individuals.
So the judge is basically questioning whether the law even applies in this situation.
Exactly. And beyond that, there are a lot of concerns about how Trump's order would actually be implemented. We're talking about Venezuelan citizens who are in the U.S., 14 or older, who are identified as members of this Trinidad gang. The problem is there's no clear process for how U.S. officials would determine who's actually a gang member and who isn't.
So it could end up being really subjective, potentially leading to a lot of people being detained without due process.
That's the big worry. Critics are saying this could be used to bypass the usual immigration proceedings where you have to prove gang affiliation. It could open the door to mass detentions based solely on someone's nationality, which is a huge red flag.
Moving on to another story that's been making headlines, there's been a shakeup in U.S.-South Africa relations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that the U.S. is expelling South Africa's ambassador to Washington.
Big news for sure. That's Ibrahim Rasool, by the way, the ambassador. And this kind of diplomatic move is pretty rare for the U.S.
So what's behind this sudden expulsion?
Well, Rubio didn't mince words. He took to X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, and called Rasool a race-baiting politician who, according to Rubio, hates the U.S. and President Trump. He declared him persona non grata, which is the official term for expelling a diplomat.
And South Africa's reaction.
Their presidential office called the decision regrettable, but emphasized their commitment to maintaining a good relationship with the U.S. They're definitely trying to keep things from escalating further.
But it sounds like there's some bad blood here.
There definitely is. A lot of this stems from remarks Rasool made in an online lecture, which were then reported by Breitbart. He basically accused Trump of fueling white supremacism and playing the victim card.
And he tied this into the MAGA movement.
He did. Rasool argued that the MAGA movement is a reaction to the changing demographics of the U.S., a kind of backlash against a more diverse society. He even went so far as to suggest that South Africa is being targeted because it represents a historical counterpoint to this idea of white supremacism.
So some pretty strong words there, and clearly they struck a nerve. But this isn't the first time U.S.-South Africa relations have been strained, is it?
No, not at all. Things have been pretty frosty ever since Trump took office. There was a recent executive order freezing U.S. aid to South Africa.
What was the reason for that?
The Trump administration cited unjust racial discrimination against white Afrikaners and concerns about land expropriation. Basically, the White House is saying they won't provide aid unless South Africa guarantees the safety and fair treatment of these minority farmers.
But South Africa has a different take on this, don't they?
Absolutely. They deny seizing land without compensation. They insist that it would only happen in very specific cases for public use and only after all other options have been exhausted.
So a classic case of he said, she said.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The White House even released a fact sheet claiming that South Africa blatantly discriminates against the descendants of settler groups. It's a very sensitive issue.
And it's interesting to note that Ambassador Rasool has a personal connection to this history of racial discrimination. He was actually forcibly removed from his home in Cape Town during the apartheid era. It's a complex situation with a lot of historical baggage.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something that's going to be resolved overnight. Now, shifting gears a bit, we've got some serious weather news from the southern U.S. Multiple tornadoes have ripped through several states, leaving a trail of destruction and, sadly, some loss of life.
How bad is it?
The latest reports say at least 20 people have been killed. Missouri seems to have been hit the hardest, with 12 fatalities reported there.
And other states.
Texas has reported 4 deaths. 3 of those in a really tragic dust storm pileup and another one from a tornado. We're also hearing about deaths in Oklahoma and Arkansas, though the exact numbers aren't clear yet. And on top of the fatalities, over 240,000 properties across 6 states are without power right now.
Wow, that's a huge number. Which states are we talking about?
Well, Texas, Missouri, and Illinois are some of the hardest hit, but the outages are spread across a wider area. And the bad news is this isn't over yet. There are tornado watches in place for central Mississippi, eastern Louisiana, and western Tennessee. They're also bracing for flash flooding.
Flash flooding. How serious are we talking?
The National Weather Service has issued warnings for those 3 states, plus Alabama and Arkansas. They're saying it could be life-threatening. And to make matters worse, there's a particularly dangerous tornado warning in effect for central Mississippi right now.
What makes it so dangerous?
The forecasters are predicting the possibility of multiple, intense, long-track tornadoes. Those are the ones that can stay on the ground for miles, causing the most damage.
It sounds like those areas need to be on high alert. What are the authorities doing?
Well, the governors of Missouri, Arkansas, and Georgia have all declared states of emergency. That will free up resources to help with the response and recovery efforts.
What about wildfires? Aren't those a risk in that region too?
You're right, and unfortunately, there's a big one burning in Oklahoma right now. It's called the 840 Road Fire, and it's already scorched over 27,000 acres. And it's 0% contained, so it's still spreading. There's a red flag warning in effect for the Panhandle, which means conditions are ripe for wildfires to ignite and spread quickly.
Sounds like a really dire situation.
It is, and to give you an idea of how bad that dust storm in Texas was, they're estimating that around 38 cars were involved in that pileup. And on top of the 840 road fire, there are reports of over 100 wildfires burning across Texas and Oklahoma.
It's easy to forget that tornado season isn't just limited to spring.
You're right, it's usually most active in May and June, but as we're seeing now, it can happen any time of year. Now, let's switch gears again and head over to Europe. Serbia is in the news today.
What's happening there?
Belgrade, the capital city, just witnessed its biggest protest ever.
Wow, how big are we talking?
Independent monitors are estimating that over 325,000 people took to the streets. It's a massive show of public anger.
What sparked these protests?
It all goes back to a tragic incident last November when a railway station in Novi Sad collapsed, killing 15 people.
What caused the collapse?
Well, that's what the protesters want to know. They're blaming the government, specifically President Alexander Vučić and his Progressive Party, for cutting corners and prioritizing profits over safety.
And was the party involved in the station's renovation?
They were very closely involved. So the protesters see a direct link between the party's actions and this tragedy.
Has the government responded to these protests?
President Vučić addressed the nation, but he mostly focused on praising the police for keeping the peace during the demonstrations. He did say he understood the protesters' message and the need for change, but it's not clear what concrete actions he's planning to take.
What's the opposition saying?
Well, they're calling for a government of experts to be put in place as a way to create a level playing field for fresh elections. They see this as the only way to ensure fairness and accountability.
And what about the student protesters?
They seem determined to keep up the pressure until they get answers about what really happened at the station and who is responsible. They don't seem likely to back down anytime soon.
In some lighter news, we've got an update on Gene Hackman's estate. The legendary actor passed away recently, and there's a bit of a mystery surrounding his will.
Yeah, his will was just released, and it's created a bit of confusion. See, Hackman named his wife, Betsy Arakawa, as his sole beneficiary. But here's the thing, Missy Arakawa also passed away recently, just a week before Hackman.
So that throws a wrench into things. What happens now?
That's the big question. Legal experts are saying that Hackman's children from his first marriage could end up inheriting the estate because of the timing of the deaths. Apparently, Arakawa's will left everything to Hackman, but it also had a clause that kicked in if they died within 90 days of each other, which they did. In that case, her assets would go into a trust and some would be donated to charity.
So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out legally.
Mm-hmm.
Now, turning back to the conflict in Gaza, there's been a new development involving a reported Israeli airstrike on a charity group.
Right. The Israeli military is claiming they targeted terrorists who were operating a drone posing a threat to Israeli troops. They say they then targeted additional terrorists who arrived at the scene.
But there's a very different perspective coming from the charity itself.
Absolutely. They are flatly denying that any of their members were terrorists. The founder of the charity, a man named Kazim Rashid Ahmad, says his team was simply setting up tents and filming their work for promotional purposes.
What exactly does he claim happened?
He says that their cameramen were hit first by the strike, and then when other team members arrived in a second car to help, they were also hit by a drone strike. It's a tragic situation, and there are conflicting accounts of what actually took place.
A reminder of the fog of war and how difficult it can be to get a clear picture of events in conflict zones. In some troubling news here in the U.S., it appears that Arlington National Cemetery has been scrubbing its website, removing information about Black and female service members.
You're right. This has caused quite a stir. Reports are saying that stories about Medal of Honor recipients, information about the Tuskegee Airmen, even the story of WWII hero Hector Santa Anna, all gone.
What about information about women who served?
Well, links to entire sections on African American history, Hispanic American history, and women's history, all gone. You can still find some content on notable women if you do a direct search, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or the 6 888 veterans, but it's not easily accessible.
What's the reason behind all of this?
A lot of people are connecting this to the previous administration's efforts to roll back DEI initiatives. That stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And what were those initiatives aimed at?
Basically ensuring fair treatment and representation for people of all backgrounds, particularly in the military and in government. But the previous administration saw these initiatives as problematic.
So there's speculation that this content removal is part of that larger effort. What does the cemetery have to say?
A spokesperson said they're working on restoring the links in content. They claim they're committed to sharing these stories of service and sacrifice, but a lot of people are skeptical.
We'll have to wait and see if those promises are kept. Switching gears now, we've got an interesting development in U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. government has been sending out questionnaires to UN aid agencies.
Yeah, this is raising some eyebrows. We're talking about agencies like the UNHCR and the ICRC, organizations that provide humanitarian aid around the world.
What are these questionnaires asking?
It's a pretty lengthy form, 36 questions in all, and it's coming from the Office of Management and Budget. They're asking about potential anti-American beliefs or affiliations.
Anti-American beliefs. That seems a bit broad, doesn't it?
It does, and to give you an idea of what we're talking about, one of the questions actually asks about links to communism.
So there's concern that this is a sign of the U.S. pulling back from its global humanitarian work, maybe even turning its back on the UN.
That's a real concern, especially considering the previous administration's focus on cost-cutting and its decision to end most U.S. aid programs. U.S. aid is the main U.S. agency for international development.
What are some of the specific questions on this form?
Well, they're asking agencies to confirm that they have no ties to communist, socialist, or totalitarian parties, or to many groups that advocate for anti-American views.
Makes you wonder what they consider anti-American views, doesn't it?
It does. They also want to make sure agencies aren't receiving any funding from China, Russia, Cuba, or Iran. And there are questions about whether any projects include DEI or climate change elements.
So that could potentially impact things like UNICEF's work on girls' education or the World Food Programme's efforts to address climate resilience.
It very well could. And it's not just about ideology. Some of the questions seem geared towards protecting U.S. economic interests. They're asking about projects that might affect American supply chains or the production of rare earth minerals, for instance.
So it sounds like a pretty intrusive questionnaire, and it's unclear how UN agencies are responding.
Well, reports are saying that they've opted to send email replies with explanations where possible instead of actually filling out the form. They're clearly trying to find a way to address the U.S. government's concerns without compromising their principles or their work.
Now, let's turn our attention to Elon Musk and his ambitious plans for space exploration. He recently reaffirmed his goal of sending a mission to Mars.
He's not letting go of that dream, is he?
Not at all. Musk says he's aiming to launch the first starships to Mars in 2026. And he's talking about sending humans to the Red Planet within 4 years after that.
So, sometime in the early 2030s, that's not that far off, considering the complexities involved.
I know, right? It's hard to wrap your head around it sometimes. And get this, he's also talking about sending Tesla's humanoid robot, Optimus, to Mars.
What's the robot supposed to do on Mars?
Musk says it's designed to handle everyday tasks, and he estimates it'll cost somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000.
Interesting. So it's not just about scientific exploration. He's thinking about the practicalities of actually living and working on Mars.
Exactly. It's important to note that this Mars mission is separate from the recent SpaceX Falcon 9 launch that carried a new crew to the International Space Station.
Right. That mission was all about bringing astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams home after an extended stay on the ISS.
It's a reminder that there's a lot of activity happening in space right now, both from private companies like SpaceX and from government agencies. Now, for a story that's been generating a lot of anger and outrage online, we turn to Australia, where a U.S. influencer is facing serious backlash for her actions involving a baby wombat.
This story has gone viral, hasn't it?
It has, and for good reason. The influencer, who describes herself as an outdoor enthusiast and hunter, was filmed picking up a wild baby wombat, a joey, while his mother was right there. And she was laughing as she did it.
That's horrible. What was she thinking?
Well, she's tried to defend herself, saying she was just trying to get the animals off the road and that the mother ran off. She claimed she was afraid of being attacked.
But wombats are protected in Australia, right?
They are. It's illegal to interfere with them without a permit. And needless to say, her actions have sparked outrage. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese even spoke out against her.
What kind of backlash is she facing?
It's been pretty intense. There's an online petition calling for her deportation that's already gotten over 40,000 signatures. The Home Affairs Minister is also reviewing whether to revoke her visa. And she's been bombarded with death threats.
Death threats. That's taking it too far, no matter how bad her actions were.
You're right, but it shows how strongly people feel about this. Conservationists are also weighing in, saying her behavior was appalling and potentially harmful to the wombats. They're worried about the stress she caused them, and it's not even clear if the joey was ever reunited with its mother.
And from the video, it looks like the joey was really distressed.
It was. You can see it hissing and struggling in her grip. It's just a sad and disturbing situation all around.
In some disheartening news from the Middle East, talks aimed at extending the ceasefire in Gaza have broken down.
So we're back to square one, pretty much. The first phase of the ceasefire, which had brought a temporary halt to the fighting, ended on March 1st. The U.S. was pushing for an extension until mid-April, and that would have included further exchanges of hostages and prisoners.
But it sounds like those talks hit a snag.
They did. A Palestinian official said there was disagreement between Israel and Hamas on some key aspects of the U.S. proposal. Israel seemed willing to continue negotiating based on the U.S. plan, which involved releasing 11 living hostages and the remains of some of those who were killed.
But Hamas wasn't on board.
The White House is accusing Hamas of making unreasonable demands, saying they're pushing for immediate talks on a permanent ceasefire without addressing the other issues on the table. They even accused Hamas of making a bad bet by thinking time is on their side. It doesn't look promising for further negotiations. In some other news, there's a developing story out of the Dominican Republic that's concerning a lot of people. A young woman, a student at the University of Pittsburgh, has been missing for over a week.
Her name is Sudiksha Kunanki, and she's only 20 years old. She disappeared on March 6th, and authorities have been searching for her ever since.
What do we know about her disappearance?
Well, at this point, it's being treated as a missing persons case. They haven't ruled anything out, but they're considering the possibility that she may have drowned.
Have they found any clues?
Not really. They've been searching for her on land, by air, using drones with AI to scan for anything unusual, and in the water, but they haven't found any evidence of foul play.
It's a heartbreaking situation for her family and friends. Are there any updates on the investigation?
The University of Pittsburgh is working with the FBI, the DEA, Homeland Security, and local authorities in the Dominican Republic to try and find her. Interpol has also issued a global yellow notice for her, which is a request to law enforcement worldwide to be on the lookout.
Hopefully they'll find her safe and sound. Now let's shift gears again to space news. SpaceX recently launched a new crew to the International Space Station.
Another successful launch for SpaceX. It seems like they've got this down to a science.
They do.
Yeah.
And this particular mission is notable because it's part of a larger plan to finally bring astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams home.
They've been up there for a while, haven't they?
They have. They were supposed to be on a short mission, just 8 days, on Boeing's experimental Starliner spacecraft. But things didn't go as planned.
What happened?
They ran into some technical issues during the launch and docking. It ended up extending their stay on the ISS for much longer than anticipated, over 9 months.
Wow, that's a long time to be away from home.
It is. And NASA ultimately decided that it was too risky to bring them back on the Starliner, so they opted to bring them home on SpaceX's Dragon capsule, which was already scheduled for a crew rotation.
So it's a case of SpaceX stepping in to help out Boeing.
Exactly. And it's interesting because Boeing maintained that their Starliner was safe for the return journey. They weren't happy about NASA's decision.
It does seem like a bit of a blow to Boeing's space program.
It is. There was actually some controversy a while back when President Trump and Elon Musk both publicly commented that the astronauts could have been brought home sooner. They blamed the delays on the current administration and political reasons.
But NASA has insisted that the decision was based purely on safety concerns, right?
They did. They said there were good technical reasons for choosing SpaceX over Boeing for the return trip. So it's a reminder that space travel is still a risky business, and safety has to be the top priority. Now let's head north to Canada, where there's been a change in leadership. Mark Carney has been sworn in as the new Prime Minister.
A new era for Canadian politics. He's the first new PM in 9 years, so it's a pretty big deal.
What's his background?
He's an economist, and he's actually pretty new to formal politics. He was elected leader of the Liberal Party, the governing party, and that paved the way for him to become Prime Minister.
It's interesting that he's coming in at a time when trade relations with the U.S. are pretty strained.
It is. He's stepping into a potentially tricky situation, and he's already made some strong statements about Canada's relationship with the U.S. He basically said that Canada would never become part of the U.S., calling that idea crazy.
Well, that's a clear message. He's definitely not shying away from asserting Canada's independence. Who did he replace as PM?
Justin Trudeau, who held the position for 9 years, he had a pretty long run.
Any word on when the next federal election will be held?
Carney hasn't confirmed the date, but it's currently scheduled for October. He's hinted that he might call an election sooner, though, to try and get a strong mandate from the people.
What are some of his first actions as PM?
Well, one of his first moves was to scrap the consumer carbon pricing program. That was a key policy of Trudeau's, aimed at addressing climate change. But it was pretty unpopular because it led to higher prices for consumers.
So he's trying to appeal to voters who are feeling the pinch of inflation.
Exactly. But it's not a complete reversal. The industrial carbon tax, which applies to large emitters, is still in place, and Canadians will get one last carbon pricing rebate in April.
So, bit of a mixed bag there. What else is on his agenda?
He's made it clear that navigating the trade relationship with the U.S. is going to be a top priority. He wants to position himself as the best person to handle those challenges.
And his background might help with that.
You're right. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada and then the governor of the Bank of England, so he's got a lot of experience with economic and financial issues.
And what about his foreign policy plans?
His first trip abroad will be to the UK and France, which signals his focus on maintaining close ties with traditional allies.
It'll be interesting to see how he navigates the political landscape.
It will. The Conservative Party actually had a significant lead in the polls before the trade war, with the U.S. started heating up. But now the polls are showing a much tighter race.
So it's anyone's game at this point.
Exactly. The Conservative leader, Poilievre, is arguing that the Liberals have been in power for too long and that it's time for a change. He's also vowed to stand up to the U.S. on trade, even threatening to impose counter tariffs if he's elected. So, buckle up, it's going to be an interesting ride. Now let's turn our attention to a disturbing report out of Iran. The UN is raising alarm about the increasingly harsh enforcement of hijab laws.
This isn't a new issue, is it?
No, it's not. But the UN report is saying that things have gotten much worse recently. They're highlighting the increasing use of technology for surveillance, things like drones and security cameras, to monitor women and make sure they're complying with the dress code.
And where is this happening?
It seems to be most prevalent in Tehran, the capital, and in southern Iran.
What are the consequences for women who don't comply?
They can be arrested, beaten, and even subjected to sexual violence while in custody. It's a really frightening situation.
And this comes on the heels of the death of Mahsa Amini last year, doesn't it?
It does. She died in police custody after being arrested for allegedly violating the hijab law. Her death sparked protests across Iran, and the UN has already concluded that the Iranian government was responsible for her death.